Welcome back. We're talking about the views of 17th century French philosopher René Descartes. In particular, we're considering Descartes' solution to the mind-body problem. According to Descartes, there are two basic kinds of things, minds and bodies. Bodies take up space, minds do not. Minds think, bodies do not. This makes Descartes' theory a version of substance dualism, the view that the world is made of two kinds of stuff. In this class, we're going to let dualism include most views that say minds are completely distinct from bodies, regardless of how many kinds of material stuff they include. Nobody really bothers with triism or quadism these days. Now, according to dualism, although minds and bodies are distinct, they normally go together, and they communicate with one another. Descartes' theory is a version of interactionist dualism, according to which minds and bodies can interact with one another even though they're distinct. In fact, as Descartes went on to elaborate his views, he argued that there are some things that neither minds nor bodies can do on their own, that they can only do when they're joined together into what he calls the soul-body union. For example, he thinks that what he calls the passions, roughly what we think of as emotions, are not had by minds or bodies alone, but only by the soul-body union. But if minds and bodies are wholly distinct and can be separated from one another, and in fact, if bodies are located in space and minds are not, then at least two important questions arise. First, how do we get to know about minds? In particular, how can we know about other people's minds? Even if I can know about my own mind just by thinking and therefore demonstrating to myself that I have a mind, that's not going to work with other people's minds. At best, my thinking implies that I exist, but my thinking simply doesn't imply that anyone else exists. And since your mind is, according to Descartes, not located in space and time, it's not the kind of thing that I can find out about by perception, like color, shape, temperature, or mass. What I can observe is just bodies. And although Descartes says that minds and bodies normally go together, he also says they can come apart. And if they do, then my perception might deceive me about whether you have a mind. This was how Descartes started his line of reasoning, after all, by throwing out any belief that could possibly be wrong. So it's hard to see how I could know about minds other than my own on Descartes' view. This is the problem of other minds. Second, how does this mind-body causal interaction work? Bodies are located in space, so they bump up against each other in various ways. And the new mechanical philosophy yields increasingly clever ways to explain those kinds of mechanical systems. Descartes was probably right that we are, by his time, at least on the right path to explaining how bodies work. But according to this dualism, minds are both completely distinct from bodies and not located in space. Keep in mind that minds on this view aren't just ghostly or transparent or ephemeral. Those are all spatial qualities. But minds are just not located in space for Descartes. How can something that's not located in space bump up against anything at all, especially something that is located in space? Even if we understand how there could be vibrations transmitted through the nerves, how could they then be transmitted on to the mind? Indeed, what would it be for something non-spatial to vibrate at all? And how could it pass those vibratory motions back into material things so they continued on as real physical vibrations? This is the origin of the second problem, the problem of mental causation. We'll talk more about the problem of other minds later. For now, we'll focus our attention on the problem of mental causation, which continues to this day to be one of the most central problems in philosophy of mind and perhaps in all of philosophy. The problem of mental causation, as it arises for dualists, is the problem of explaining how something material and spatial could cause or be caused by something immaterial and non-spatial. Given that Descartes and the mechanical physics construe causation in terms of pushing and pulling, it doesn't seem that there can be any immaterial causation. This point was made to Descartes by several philosophers, but the person who really got him to face the issue was Princess Elisabeth of Bohemia in her correspondence with Descartes. As quoted in the article you read, Elisabeth writes to Descartes as follows: "I beseech you, tell me how the soul of man, since it is but thinking substance, can determine the spirits of the body to produce voluntary actions. For it seems every determination of movement happens from an impulsion of the thing moved, according to the manner in which it is pushed by that which moves it, or else depends on the qualification and figure of the superficies of the latter. Contact is required for the first two conditions, and extension for the third. You entirely exclude extension from your notion of the soul, and contact seems to be incompatible with an immaterial thing. That is why I ask you a definition of soul more particular than your metaphysics. That is to say, for a definition of substance separate from its action, thought. Here Princess Elisabeth, in her polite 17th century prose, puts the issue precisely. If minds, that is souls, are immaterial and not extended, not located in space, then they don't have the features that are required for them to cause changes in bodies. So how can it be true that immaterial minds and material bodies interact? This is the problem of mental causation in a nutshell. Now then, why is the problem of mental causation a big deal? Well, one reason that we expect a theory to explain mental causation is that we all have the experience of our thoughts causing our behavior. It surely seems that I can desire to raise my hand, believe that raising my hand is a good idea, and thereby cause my arm to move and raise my hand. It also seems that the world causes changes in my mind, such as when I look out the window and form the belief that it's a pleasant sunny day. But beyond everyday experience, the assumption that mental causation is possible grounds several other important practices. If my beliefs about trees or weather aren't caused, at least in part, by the state of the world, then it's unclear how I can come to know about those things. Theories of knowledge, especially perceptual knowledge, typically rely on the fact that the world is a cause of our beliefs and our desires. So mental causation is important for epistemology, for theories of knowledge. Likewise, moral and legal theories typically distinguish between events that happen in the world independently of me and those that I cause. Typically, we judge that I'm only responsible for the effects that I cause, and I'm only morally and legally responsible for my actions, the behaviors that are caused by me, by my decisions, that is, my beliefs and desires, and not just any other bodily effect. Suppose I'm in a crowd of people on a subway platform. The crowd surges forward, I'm knocked into a person who's in turn knocked onto the tracks. We can all agree that something terrible happened, but we don't usually think that I'm responsible for that effect. I might feel terrible about the outcome, but I shouldn't feel that I'm blameworthy. In contrast, if I push someone onto the tracks, then I would be to blame. I'd be morally and legally responsible. Think about it from the point of view of innocence and guilt. In a court of law, I can defend myself by arguing I wasn't the cause of the event. Perhaps it was the person next to me, rather than me, who bumped the victim onto the tracks. But I can also defend myself by saying that although it was me who bumped the victim, it was not due to any action of mine. The cause was not any belief or desire of mine, it's just that I too was pushed. The bumping was something that happened, but not something that I did. So it looks like mental causation is important for theories of moral and legal responsibility if we need to make these distinctions. These are just two examples, and I'm sure you can think of others. A whole lot of ways that we think about ourselves as persons depend on the assumption that our thoughts can cause and be caused by goings-on in the world. So if there's no mental causation, other dominoes may fall. Because this is a longer than usual lesson, we're going to take an intermission. Feel free to pause here before continuing. Okay, now we have a handle on the problem of mental causation. How do we solve it? One possibility is to give up the idea that mind is an immaterial substance, that is, give up on dualism and adopt some variety of monism, the view that there's only one kind of stuff in the world. Most of the theories we'll consider after this week are of that variety. But we're not there yet. Right now, we need to know what to do if we're dualists. How do dualists explain mental causation? One option, which we can attribute to Descartes himself, is to insist on mind-body interaction and try to explain how it's possible. Neither Princess Elisabeth nor ultimately Descartes himself were entirely satisfied by his proposals, but he thought that mind-body interaction must occur. At the end of the day then, interactionist dualism relies on a promise that we don't know how to fulfill and that we have some reasons to doubt could ever be fulfilled. Another option is to get some powerful outside help. There are two main varieties of this approach. The first version is due to Descartes' follower Nicolas Malebranche. Malebranche admitted that mind and body can't interact on their own, but he proposed that God could intervene to enable their interaction. According to Malebranche, on every occasion of mind-body interaction, God creates a little miracle that enables the two distinct substances to causally interact. Malebranche's theory, occasionalism, nevertheless raises several questions. One is whether this really counts as mental causation if God's doing the work. But perhaps the bigger issue is that it seems to require quite a lot from God. Now, if God is infinite and all-powerful, it's not like it's too much work. But even more worrisome is that occasionalism requires quite a few more miracles than even the most devout theists usually think of God as creating. The point of miracles is that they're supposed to be special, and this makes them rather mundane. Why didn't God just make minds and bodies able to interact on their own? The second view that relies on outside help, and the one mentioned by Kwame Appiah in his chapter, is the parallelism associated with Gottfried Leibniz. Leibniz, who you may know as the co-discoverer of calculus, admitted that mind and body can't interact on their own. And he also appealed to the power of God. But instead of having God intervene on every occasion, Leibniz proposed that God organized the universe perfectly at creation so that minds and bodies would run in parallel like two synchronized watches. This only requires one miracle from God, and it's the miracle of creation that most of Leibniz's devout peers already believed in. But the downside is that by admitting minds and bodies don't really interact, it gives up on genuine mental causation, and hence on all the good stuff that depends on mental causation, like perceptual knowledge, responsibility, free will, and more. Leibniz is parodied as Dr. Pangloss in Voltaire's novel Candide. Pangloss always claimed no matter what terrible things happen, that this is the best of all possible worlds and God must want things exactly this way. The last mainstream dualistic alternative to interactionism is that bodies can cause minds but not vice versa. On this view, so-called Epiphenomenalism, mental events are byproducts of bodily events, given off by bodily processes like the whistle of a steam engine. Like the ringing of a bell in a clock tower, the mind is caused by the body but has no effect on its operation. The running of the clock causes the bell to ring, but the ringing of the bell has no effect on the operation of the clock. If the bell breaks, the clock can still run. Most contemporary philosophers find all of these options unacceptable. Very few people have thought that occasionalism or parallelism are attractive ideas. And these days, the term epiphenomenalism is used to cover any theory that denies that minds and bodies can interact on their own, not just the byproduct view. So all the views other than interactionism are considered versions of epiphenomenalism these days. Descartes' insistence that mind-body interaction must happen, but without any viable account of how immaterial substances can cause anything at all, is plainly inadequate. When asked to explain how mental causation is possible, we can't just say it is. This is to beg the question. An argument that assumes what it's trying to prove is valid, the conclusion must be true if the premises are true, but such an argument can't be a reason to accept the conclusion because it already assumes that same conclusion. This is the logical fallacy called begging the question. Begging the question doesn't mean that it forces us to ask a question. It means the argument assumes what it's trying to prove. In this case, faced with the question of how mental causation is possible, we can't just say that it is. That's what we're being asked to explain. Most philosophers conclude that substance dualism implies epiphenomenalism, that according to dualism, mind and body can't causally interact after all. Now, some people are willing to accept epiphenomenalism, but most regard that outcome as sufficiently problematic that it's a fatal flaw for dualism. The upshot is that most contemporary philosophers abandon substance dualism and opt for some variety of monism, the view that there's only one kind of substance in the world, which we usually think of as being material or physical stuff. Saying more about that stuff is sometimes part of philosophy, but more often we think of inquiry into the stuff of the world as the business of physics. Philosophers, however, still have a lot to say about the relationship between that stuff and mental phenomena. Our next module begins to explore those theories.